We now welcome to the stage our host for the next session, Louise Monger, Vice President of Digital Energy, Schneider Electric.
Thank you, everyone. So let me share with you a provocative statement. Construction procurement has not kept pace with our sustainability ambitions. Do you agree? When we think about construction procurement, the methods that served us well in the past are not fit for purpose today. The result is not just friction in the delivery process, but finished products that are falling short of asset owner expectations, sustainability targets, and the user experience. Joining me today to talk about this problem and some of the solutions are my panellists. Chris Nunn, General Manager of ESG at Scape. Chris has over 25 years of experience delivering sustainability solutions to the built environment. And something I find really interesting about Chris is that he was a former chair of the Passive House Association, and he lives with his family in a passive house in Sydney. And another Chris, just to keep me on my toes, two Chris's today, Chris Learmonth, the Executive General Manager for major projects at Landlease. Chris is spearheading the company's growth into the data centre segment in Australia. Welcome. So we've got hopefully a thought-provoking topic for everybody here today. We've got a unique opportunity at this summit with the whole construction value chain represented. So what better time to have a really thought-provoking conversation about some of the challenges that we see that unfold in construction and the resulting shortfall we may potentially have with our sustainability ambitions. So Chris Nunn, starting with you, you're someone that's worked with different investment managers across lots of different asset classes. Can you start by explaining the exact nature of this problem?
Yeah, I guess there's two sides to that. We need to address climate change in terms of the built environment. It's 40% of global emissions. What we need is highly efficient buildings, ideally 80% lower energy consumption than we have today. We need them to be running on renewable electricity. We need to get them all electric, no gas. We need them to be responsive to fluctuations in generation patterns, so demand response and grid interactive buildings. We need them to have low global warming potential refrigerants, which are actually not widespread in terms of a technology pathway yet. And we need them to have low embodied carbon, because half of the 40% of the emissions are in the structure and the facade and the other building components that make up the building. So I guess there's a range of challenges there, and then how I've seen that expressed across a range of different asset classes is kind of fun to think about. In terms of office, we've seen potentially overglazed, too much glass, because it's being driven by a leasing sales moment where the view is everything, but that's not necessarily a high-performance facade. I've seen industrial buildings with long span roofs that the structure hasn't allowed enough tolerance to put the solar panels on after because they can't support the weight. I've seen shopping centres where the doors are open because they want customers to flow in and out of the space, but they're open 24/7 with the conditioned air just spilling out into the environment forever. And I've seen residential buildings where we've had overglazing resulting in overheating in summer and then cold, thermal bridge effects and condensation and mould. And so we have a host of sort of problems of integrating sustainability into a range of different asset classes. And that's really what we're here to talk about today.
So can you tell me a bit more about some of the governance structures? How do we actually get to a situation where we're building things that aren't aligned with those sustainability objectives that you outlined? Like, what is going wrong in the way that we're setting this up?
Yeah, I think split incentives is something that's, I guess, a touchstone for why some of these problems emerge. Not so evident in office in the sense that there's an alignment often between the developer with the end office user in mind end office users demanding highly sustainable buildings, lots of disclosure with neighbours ratings. So I think office is relatively mature in this space. Industrial, less so, retail, less so, and residential, where I'm currently working. I work for Scape, which is a purpose-built student accommodation and build-to-rent operator, developer, owner, operator. In the residential space, we've seen this classic problem of a build-to-sell developer wanting to deliver the least cost code-compliant building that they can sell for the maximum value and really push all the operational problems onto strata. So mum and dad who buy the apartment are then left with overheating from the west, or a huge heating problem in winter if they're on the south, condensation and mould, and not really an ability to solve that because these problems are locked into the building on day one of construction. They're life cycle problems, and you really get one shot at a high performance facade during the design and construction stage, and you can't retrofit a high performance facade easily. That's an extremely expensive thing to do. You can retrofit some of the HVAC technologies and controls technologies during the life, and we are seeing a lot of that happening, but getting the gas out of an existing gas-fired building can be really tough to do. And likewise, getting the refrigerants out can be really tough to do.
But of course, that places that cost of those capital upgrades to the owner that has that asset holding for the long term. So really, we need to start thinking about things as a total cost of ownership and not just in the construction phase. And to the other, Chris, what is at stake here? What are the negative outcomes when we get it wrong? You would have seen this across many major projects at Landlease. I'm sure good and bad examples over your career.
No bad Landlease examples.
So what are some of the negative outcomes when we get it wrong?
Yeah, I think there's just absolute horror stories out there, and sort of Chris just shared just a couple of examples. And look, I do a lot of work in the data center space, and I sort of see some really good and bad examples there. And sort of some of the bad ones, you look at data centers as an asset class, and it's inherently not really a sustainable asset. It uses materials like concrete, steel, aluminium with, that has sort of a large carbon footprint, and it consumes an enormous amount of water for its cooling systems. It consumes enormous amounts of power. So you really have to work really, really hard to get these things to work on a sustainable basis. And just back to the power, it's just crazy how much juice these things suck up. It's incredible. It's like, if you just to put in perspective, a sort of average size data center is sort of 60 megawatts. And okay, 60 megawatts, is that big? Is that small? Well, like if you can compare that to our Barangaroo development, that includes 13 buildings, 3 huge commercial towers, 3 huge residential towers, the Crown development. If you sort of just put all that together and you look at the energy consumption, it doesn't even equate to half of one of those data centers. So then you sort of look at the procurement process, and when I see sort of providers, they will go out to market on sort of a fully resolved design with no contractor input, no supply chain input, ESD objectives, maybe sort of loose in the procurement documents. Obviously the end result's not going to be a great one. And even if someone has a great sustainability initiative along the way, like Chris said, it's generally too late then. So to answer your question, I reckon there's a lot at stake here, because when those poor sustainability outcomes can just really produce long-lasting effects.
Long-lasting problems. Chris, Nunn, can you elaborate further on that? So the relative contribution of this problem in different asset classes and how you see that show up, and what are the implications across the life cycle? Because not all asset managers are sort of, have the same capability through the life cycle of their assets as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think, as I mentioned, office is largely solving this with an awareness of what the tenant wants, with mandatory disclosure, the commercial building disclosure scheme, neighbours ratings being ubiquitous in office, there being that alignment between I'm a corporate tenant, I want a 5.5 star or a 6 star neighbours rated building, I'm a commercial developer, whether I'm developing it with an anchor tenant or speculatively, I kind of understand the sustainability aspiration and can deliver a product that's pretty efficient, high-ish performance facade, possibly not overglazed, or we're still battling with that, decent mech and good controls and some experimentation around grid interactive. So I think office is probably leading in terms of its level of sophistication and alignment between the investor and the operator. Industrial, to the extent that it's still speculative, like is this a shed that's going to be a warehouse, or is this going to host huge process loads? And they're kind of different end uses, but when you're developing an industrial development, you might be thinking about both of those use cases. So industrial's tricky, and you've got a range of end uses, some super high energy, some super low energy. Do we need solar? Do we need batteries? Etc. Shopping centres, I think, leading into mixed use. Contemplating big holes punched through shopping centres to get the foundations down for a tower that comes out the top of residential or build to rent, that can then be a captive audience and market for the shopping centre below, but that being extremely disruptive to the building model, and also that being a barrier to sustainability because, look, if I'm going to do a mixed use tower out of the top of my shopping centre, do I really want the solar on because the tower's going to shade that part of the roof? And by the way, the tenant wants access to that roof because Coles is the anchor or Woolies is the anchor and they want to put solar on their own roof to power their fridges. And so the tension between tenants and landlord plus future development prospects in shopping centres is something that I've seen. And then in residential, right, we've had this build to sell model. I'm really excited. One of the things I got excited about joining Scape was that within the student accommodation sector, we are the developer, owner and operator, and we charge an all-in rent to our resident customers. So we wear the utility costs. So we should have the greatest incentive in student to invest a little bit more upfront to get a better life cycle outcome in terms of operating costs. And I'm excited also about build to rent in resi, where you've got institutional capital coming in, setting high ESG aspirations in terms of particularly net zero and climate change in residential. I think that's going to really lift the quality of residential apartments that are being delivered with institutional capital coming in, expecting a higher quality product, and also linking it to debt. Scape has a sustainability-linked loan, so a $2.5 billion debt facility with a consortia of 9 banks, and we get a 0.5% interest rate discount if we hit our agreed sustainability targets. So we're seeing more incentives come through equity and debt arrangements, and then better alignment between the incentives for the developer and the ultimate operator and occupant.
I can see how that would align the incentives for many stakeholders. How do global investors know what they're investing in this market? So how are they comparing build to rent or student accommodation in Australia to maybe investments that they would have access to in Europe or the US?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, from a sustainability perspective, there's a range of tools that they're using to evaluate our ESG performance. Historically, in Australia, we've had Green Star for new builds and more recently Green Star Performance for operational buildings. And we've had neighbours, primarily in the office, to a certain extent in retail. We've had NatHERS and Basics in resi. But those standards, and then we've had the building code, of course, underpinning that with minimum standards of safety and energy performance. I think that's our sort of legacy policy incentive structure for the top end to hit high Green Star ratings and neighbours ratings, and from the bottom end to meet code and maybe a NatHERS star rating. And those are not things that international investors, international debt and equity partners are familiar with. And so they are looking to more global metrics and more performance-oriented targets like fundamental kilowatt hours per metre squared or kilowatt hours per user or power usage effectiveness in data centres, right? Yep. We have these global metrics that we're starting to become familiar with. So I think there's a real shift away from a star rating, which conceals a lot of trade-offs and complexity, to fundamental performance metrics on energy and comfort. Like Passive House is something I'm particularly an adherent to, and it says, right, we've got to keep the temperature between 20 and 25 degrees, 40-60% RH, that's the comfort side, and we're getting these huge energy efficiency benefits, typically 90% less energy on HVAC in a passive house, and 60 to 70% lower whole building energy consumption over the life of the building. So fundamental performance metrics and the application of international standards like passive house in a domestic environment, which has been used to local tools like Green Star and Neighbours.
And that would serve everybody in the community, anyone who's buying a house or renting a house. I've noticed when I've travelled to other cities in Europe that when you look in the, you have your dreaming of looking at the real estate that you would buy if you happen to live in that city, and it has a rate per square, the energy usage per square metre, so you can actually see what you're buying. And we don't really have that. We're not really giving enough of an insight into that total cost of ownership here in this market. So, Chris, other building segments, which, you support the development of data centres, you're working in other segments as well. Which segments are doing this the best to set up to get the best outcomes for sustainability over the long term?
I see sort of good and bad examples in all sectors. And actually even in the same projects, good and bad examples, which is crazy. So I just want to sort of tap into a bit on that previous panel, which sort of talked about behaviours and collaboration. And I actually find that is the biggest difference to actually creating better sustainable outcomes, all starting with a vision, and really just all of the value chain just really needs to be engaged into that vision all the way through. And if it's not, it just kind of gets just watered down, and then, it kind of gets forgotten about. So just by way of example, I look at our Barangaroo development, and, it's got some good sustainability stats. All the commercial buildings have achieved 6-star Green Star. It uses central energy plant using seawater as the heat rejection. It has the first mass-engineered timber office building. It's the first precinct to achieve 100% carbon neutrality for climate active. So, okay, cool stats, but how did it happen? First that happened just with the vision, and then, the whole organisation wasn't on board all the way through. And I must admit, it is easier, like your organisation, when you're the investor, developer, builder, all wrapped up in one, so you can kind of drive that change through the organisation and push that through to the supply chain. But I still see good examples outside of Landlease. And just putting my builder's hat on, I think just going back to procurement models, just more times than not, I just find the most effective procurement models always involved early contractor involvement and early supply chain engagement, because by the time, if you go through a whole design process and then engage with the supply chain, it's just generally just too late. And so, if you're getting all the innovations, all the smarts from the industry, and you're doing that in real time when the design's being generated, that generally produces the best result. So
are you talking there about design and construct? Because I have promised lots of people I've spoken to over the last 2 days we would have a good debate over design and construct. I'm sure there's fans. I'm sure there's people that have their views otherwise. But what about that model? And I'd love to hear about some of the risks and opportunities, shall we say, with D&C, because I think that's what you're saying there, Chris, when you're describing that process.
So what I'm talking about there doesn't necessarily have to be D&C, and we've undertaken ECI models before where we're providing that value through a process which ultimately becomes sort of a build only. So, but I'll absolutely declare my interest here. I'm 100% on board with D&C, guilty as charged. And just to me, that's just the best way just to unlock all the smarts and innovations in the industry. And if you compare that to a traditional model where it's fully designed by a design team, instructed by an owner, that could possibly produce a good result, but you're absolutely beholden to, the designer that's holding the pen at the time of writing that specification.
Yeah.
And there is just a huge wealth of knowledge that's sitting in the industry that is just not being utilised at that point. So, and to me, it just comes down to just the quality of the brief that's being written. And if the brief is good, you'll get a good outcome.
Okay, but I mean, Chris, you've been on the receiving end of taking over buildings that have been, constructed or delivered to a D&C model. So what are some of the challenges that you've seen, the outputs of that model, and where did it go wrong?
Yeah, I guess some of that's inherent to D&C and some of it's the people factors and quality of the brief and handover, etc. But I guess I've seen risks even at the feasibility stage where the investment manager is preparing a feasibility study that looks at construction costs on a historical metre squared rates basis that doesn't include any innovation. There's certainly not provision for retrofitting cross-laminated timber structures or high-performance facades or amazing control systems or grid interactive buildings. None of that's been thought of at the feso stage, so the provisional sums are strict and too tight necessarily to allow that level of innovation. At the concept design stage, I've seen, for instance, the facade design getting locked in super early, like an early concept sketch by an architect gets approved through investment committee and then into planning without there being much iterative involvement, no energy modelling, no early contractor involvement around buildability, no ops team involvement about how we're going to run this building. Is that DA concept going to work for us with, the interface of the loading dock to the street and a whole bunch of other stuff that really matter to ops, having been kind of locked in at a concept stage where there hasn't been early contractor involvement, there hasn't been ops involvement. At the planning stage, once that DA is locked in, the incentive is to press on and execute that design. At the detailed design stage, there can be really conflicting imperatives. Consultants getting squeezed because they've had to win the job with a least cost pitch, and that was pretty much the same building I designed last time, tweaked for this time, and there's not enough time to iterate, to model, to find creative solutions to the unique challenges of this site and this project. The project manager, really wanting to push through fast because the clock's ticking. I've got capital, waiting to be deployed, and I need to get this job done fast. QSs involved at even design, concept and detailed stage, let alone, value engineering during D&C post-construction docs. Potentially also using historical metre squared rates and therefore not allowing for, the level of innovation or technology that we'd like to see from an ESG perspective. Is it an all-electric building? No, you haven't allowed for the heat pumps. This is you're working on a QS model with a gas-fired building, which is a less capital-intensive day one first cost, but better whole life cost. And then contractors sort of getting squeezed through the D&C process, not having made a sufficient allowance to hit that design intent, and then, arguing for substitutions and variations that can get into conflict potentially. The commissioning process, you can also kind of go wrong at handover or during defects liability periods where design intent, hasn't been tracked through the design and the D&C process sufficiently by the client with enough oversight to actually get the outcome they want, and then it's not right at the end, and then there's expensive disputes and rectification works. And so I guess I've seen all of that happen, and I guess it comes back to contractors not being involved early enough, ops not being involved early enough, not enough stakeholder collaboration, not enough freedom to iterate during the design to make sure the solution is right, so that when it gets to D&C and starts to face the pressure of redesign and value engineering, that objective can get lost.
Okay, so if, like many people in the audience here today do participate in the construction value chain somehow, whether you're a builder, consultant or a contractor, Chris, how do you set up for success in the D&C model? Because I think we all need to agree that it's here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. It's probably producing the best innovation outcomes. but we also know that it can also result in a race to the bottom in some projects. So what can we do as a group if we really want to go after these sustainability ambitions and deliver better quality projects? How do we set up D&C for success?
Okay, so in my opinion, so D&C, this is just not the answer just for everything, every project, every time, because there's a level of sophistication that needs to go with it in your delivery partner. So in projects that just don't need that level of sophistication, you kind of don't need it. But to me, just the best outcomes is just with a well-defined brief. So if the brief is drive the best cost outcome, that is what you're going to get. So the criticism of D&C is, you just are just dumbing down a product. Well, if that is what the objective of the brief is, then that's what you'll get.
Well, I would like to challenge that. I'm going to continue to be provocative here. So and I agree the brief is something, but who's the protector of the brief? Say we've got a great brief and that's there and that's in the project and we all agree that if we can deliver those outcomes, we're going to have an amazing sustainable building with technology that delivers an outstanding customer experience. Whose role is it to protect that brief?
So generally the owner or the owner's representative.
Yeah.
And if, we see examples all the time where, okay, you might have a great brief, but that's just like a wish list. So you get a situation where it's, when push comes to shove, it's like, okay, that's not really that important. Yeah. So come up with a good brief and absolutely stick to it. And, you'll generally get an innovative outcome if you're passionate about that, because you've got to drive that from start.
So we're relying on a certain level of sophistication in the end user, or at least they've engaged a consultant that can represent their interests sufficiently across the construction process. Yep. And that's where you would see you're getting better outcomes, more aligned to that original intent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess there's conflicting priorities within the brief, though. Of course, investors and developers, they want both. They want the least cost solution and all the sustainability features, right? So that's the tension that I think both the D&C contractor and the design team have to work with the client to resolve, right? And, as the ESG manager, I'm going into bat for a range of sustainability outcomes. And I guess from my perspective, where I think I've been most successful is being able to define the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. So here's I don't want to budge on this. And for me, in residential at the moment, I want minimum double glazing and high-performance frames on my windows and doors to get a high-performance fabric. And then I also want mechanical ventilation with heat recovery in residential so that I'm getting continuous filtered fresh air through a heat exchanger, which is recovering a lot of the energy that I'm putting into the building. So all the heating and cooling energy I get put in, most of that gets recovered through the heat exchanger. And so I'm getting a really low energy, high comfort building. And if I'm clear as the ESG manager about those aspirations and them being my stick in the mud points, that I want MVHR and I want a high performance window system, then I think I can get that. But if I'm like, oh, I want a 6-star green star, I want net zero, I want all electric, then there's trade-offs within getting a 6-star rating or a 5-star rating that you're sort of outsourcing to the design team with a cost lens of what's the least cost pathway to the highest possible green star score. That doesn't necessarily get you the building you want, it gets you the highest rating for the lowest possible cost. And so this is, I think, where the tensions can creep in, is if you just outsource it to the rating system, then you get the least cost pathway to the highest rated outcome.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think hopefully we're now all broadly in agreement that we do have some challenges in reaching our ambitions. And what are some of the other solutions? We touched on a few there, but Chris Nunn, what else can we do? What are some of the solutions currently? But where do you see this going? What else might we be able to do here?
Yeah, we had a good example within Scape where we did a feasibility study on passive house for a big residential student accommodation building, and the finding was it was going to cost 4% more construction cost to get to passive house certification, which is, world's best practice, and that was going to deliver a 67% lower whole building energy consumption every year for its operational life. But it was still a challenge to get the 4%. So in the end, that project didn't go ahead because of the early stage feasibility, which had set the budget relative to an existing VAU and the inability to unlock that 4% through the process. So the sort of solution that I came up with there is, well, if my wish list of my heat pumps, I want CO2 heat pumps for hot water, and I want mechanical ventilation with heat recovery from my fresh air delivery. They're my two big wish list technical items, and I want that high performance facade. Can I take the heat pumps and the heat exchangers out of the D&C contract as a provisional sum and come up with third-party financing that is paid for through the first 10 years of the operation of the building to effectively take those energy savings in the first 10 years and pay for the additional 4% that gets me to the passive house outcome? And so that's really a model that I'm trying to explore, is because a lot of this tension is between higher first capital costs with lower lifetime operating costs. So we want to be able to unlock some of those operating savings to put into the development bucket so we get the higher quality outcomes at day one. And I think those innovative finance arrangements where that might be on-bill finance in partnership with my electricity retailer. They're able to put a charge on my electricity bill that pays for the capex of my mechanical ventilation with heat recovery units. Or environmental upgrade agreements, which is a structure where you enter a three-way agreement with the council and the developer and the builder, where the council puts the extra cost onto the council rates. So that can be charged as part of rates, and that actually runs with the land. So if you sell the building, then the extra money that you put into the building at day one development actually goes to the next owner to repay through the operating cost savings as intended. So I think a lot of this comes down to financial incentives, like the sustainability loan and what targets we've got that linked to that unlock some value that we can put toward better development, equity commitments that we have with our investors that are locked into certain sustainability performance outcomes, and then these clever mechanisms we can bring to bear, in partnership with the D&C model or a more traditional contracting model. But I think it's unlocking those operating savings to pay for the quality that we want on day one of construction.
And other Chris, in terms of from a builder's perspective, what else can you build on that? What would you say from a builder's perspective we could and should be doing?
Firstly, I think just the big thing is just the behaviours. That's what I think will drive the best change. But what I'm actually really excited about is how AI can actually help, solve some of these problems. And, Chris, I take your sort of example earlier, and that sort of decision not to proceed, that was sort of at the investment stage. And if I just put my developer hat on for a sec, and a lot of these decisions, just at the time of making that investment decision, there's just so much going on at that point in time. And, commercial assessments, they're really finely balanced. There's a lot to consider. There's cost, time, risk, revenues, all sort of wrapped up into that process. And really, those big, bold sustainability decisions, they really need to get made at that sort of point in time. So I sort of look at it, okay, what are the sort of barriers? And, I don't think any organisation is out there intentionally trying to create unsustainable products. I don't think there's, some evil mastermind out there, Monty Burns style, that's just like, let's create just the most unsustainable product there is. I just think it's just virtue of just how the process works. And like if you take embodied carbon, for example, it's like, okay, how do you work that out? Generally, you need to produce a design, and then you can then calculate what the embodied carbon impact is of that design. So that is quite far down the process. So I'm like, okay, well, how can AI help? So, like I've witnessed firsthand to see that, AI is helping produce designs from scratch. And, I see a world where like full designs are being created with the help of AI. And of course, there's still humans involved. But that gives you the ability to test like hundreds, thousands of schemes like in an instant. So then if you're able to do all this design modelling like really quickly, then you're able to calculate the carbon, environmental and social sustainability cost in an instant, and then also link that to cost, time, risk analysis. So it's like, okay, then if you can make that sort of analysis at the investment decision, I think that's going to produce better sustainability outcomes. And sure, we're not there now, but like I'm excited to think like what the possibilities are.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit today, sometimes the economics just don't stack up to do everything that you would like to do, certainly, Chris, in your buildings. But what do we need governments to do to support better outcomes? We're, approaching a federal election, we've got national construction codes. What would we ask our governments to change in order to deliver, help the industry deliver more sustainable outcomes?
Yeah, from a policy perspective, we have seen the commercial building disclosure rules be really effective in driving transparent disclosures of NABERS ratings in commercial office so that tenants are clear what they're buying and landlords are building to a standard that they know that the market is demanding. And we're seeing, higher returns for premium rated assets that have these sustainability rating tools applied. So the extension of the commercial building disclosure system and universal ratings to other asset classes. But of course, that needs to be the right rating tool. And so whether NatHERS needs to become NatHERS 2.0 in order to become, I guess, an effective policy tool in the residential sector is one of the things that I am advocating for. I think NatHERS currently lets you have a 15-degree temperature in winter and a 27-degree temperature in summer, and that's not really how we live. We prefer to live, between 20 and 25 and stable temperatures, but that's really what NatHERS and the sort of 7.5-star rating is designed to achieve. It's just a minimum level of heating and a minimum level of cooling in summer, and that's really not even consistent with the World Health Organization minimum standards for buildings, which is 18 degrees for a healthy person and 20 degrees for a vulnerable or elderly person minimum, and then 25 max. So we kind of got to be designing to these performance metrics around comfort and energy efficiency. And that's what I really like about Passive House. It says, get to these comfort, 20 to 25 degrees, 40, 60 RH, certain amount of airflow per hour per person, plus hit this energy target of 60 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum. And once you've got some really clear design parameters like that, you can start to then apply parametric modelling, all the iteration during the design process to co-optimise for those outcomes, plus co-optimise for cost, and then you can get really high performance buildings. So we need, I guess, policies that incentivise us to design toward those very transparently disclosed and government regulated performance standards.
I might jump in here and just add to that. Like with government, I think they've got a role to play in primary industry. So, I sort of look at, where we can sort of take care of the demand side, but then there's also, the supply side of the equation. So, in Australia, we don't have a green steel industry. We don't have low carbon aluminium options. And even, biodiesel. So, I think government's got a role to play there because, that's just not going to happen by itself. It's just not commercially viable to produce that sort of investment if you're just relying on just, private investment. So, I definitely think government's got a role to play there. And then, obviously when there's more throughput, then it will reduce cost over time.
Yep. So we're just about at time. If we bring this back to the audience, and as I mentioned, we do have almost the whole value chain represented at the summit. We've got facility managers, asset owners, mechanical contractors, electrical contractors, builders, sustainability managers. We're all here. Where are we going to start, Chris Nunn?
Yeah, I think ESG managers like myself can be clearer in what are the must-have versus the nice-to-haves, and the must-haves are the practical, cost-effective solutions that get you comfort and low energy, and then the nice-to-haves might be a whole bunch of a wish list that might be a longer, say, Green Star process. I think fundamentally focusing on those energy and comfort performance outcomes for the occupants of the building and for the future operating costs go back to customer experience and operating costs. So ESG metrics that really deliver against those two objectives of energy and comfort, which I think Passive House for me really does. The earlier you can get the contractors involved, absolutely. The earlier you can get the operations team to review concept designs, and then some clever financing models that unlock those lifetime operational savings to get the extra budget we need at the development stage to get the high quality buildings we need for the future.
Yep. And Chris, where would we start?
So in my opinion, I think we have already started. And I kind of look back sort of 10 years ago, and I think, we've been sort of slow on the uptake, but we have been moving in the right direction. You look at the rating tools, Green Star, Neighbours, Wells, Passive House, they're at least commonplace now. And they're being utilised. A number of organisations like ours have committed to carbon neutrality. So, there's been some big steps, but obviously there's just heaps to go. And I go back to my previous point, it just comes back down to behaviours and starting with that bold vision and then just making sure that gets driven all the way through to the supply chain and just everyone has just a role to play in that.
Yep, I agree. So if I do come back to that statement I started with, construction procurement has not kept pace with our sustainability ambitions. Hopefully everyone is a little bit clearer on some of that challenge in front of us and we can leave a bit more informed about the opportunities ahead. I think, as Chris said, it's important to recognise that there isn't some evil, nefarious anti-sustainability person in a construction project working against all of our grand plans, and we do need to ensure that everyone's doing their best, and everyone also needs to make a buck on the way through and have sustainable projects for all. So please join me in thanking our panellists today, Chris Nunn and Chris Learmonth. Thank you.